All right, welcome everybody to this short webinar on the state of the market, architecture and design in 2025 in Australia. I'm lucky enough to be joined here by Luke Russo, Krista Shearer and Georgie Bryce, the Managing Directors of our Australian offices in Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney. And we're going to talk through our annual global salary guide, as well as our architecture and design market report. We'll talk about some of the trends that are going on in the market, how salaries are going, how people are feeling in general. So thanks so much for being here, and thanks to our panelists for coming on. So I thought I'd just start by getting a general sense of the market in general, how we're feeling in both your cities. Luke, you're looking after Brisbane. You've been running that office for about a year now. So how's things going? How have you seen things change in that 12 months, and how people are feeling overall?
Yeah, I think so. I joined in October 23, and so going into last year 24, a lot of the clients we spoke to, there's just a real air of uncertainty about what was going to happen in that year. I think everyone was, really keen to get going on projects and get hiring, but there was just, there's I guess it's hard to make plans on moving ground. So fast forward to November, December 24, and the attitude has definitely changed our clients. They are feeling really positive about this year. I think with in Brisbane in particular, the 100-day review is coming to a close, and once that's done, a lot of the plans, the Olympics, are going to get released and locked in. So I think everyone knows that Brisbane's going to get really, really busy, and it feels like everyone's starting to prepare for that now.
Great. That sounds very encouraging. How about in Sydney, Krista? How are things for you guys?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit similar. I think probably not as much tied into, obviously we don't have the Olympics coming, but I'd say since August last year, things have been steadily sort of picking up after a bit of a sort of, cooling off post-pandemic boom. In sort of 23, it really kind of, the brakes sort of came on, and it's been, a mixed bag and a bit of a tough market for the last, that period in between. But from August, it really has been picking up. We've sort of seen a lot of security within the mid-sized practices where they didn't have as many overheads and they might have had deeper sort of client relationships. The sectors that have really been keeping Sydney going, residential across all the tiers, multi-res, private, and even government. There's a shortage of housing here, and I think we're very lucky that has sort of kept people charging through. So there hasn't been one moment in that period where we didn't have a lot of residential of different scales, roles for us to look for. I'd say now there's definitely, there's some of the government-led sectors are starting to pick up again. Infrastructure, health, education, they're all sort of on the move. I think it's, compared to this time last year, we're in a really good position. Most people that we're speaking to at the moment, surprisingly and pleasingly, are either hiring now or looking to recruit in the next quarter, I would say. So, it's looking really good. There's sort of the demand's there. I think the market's still, it's still definitely an employer's market. And there's some of the bigger practices, I think, that's been tougher for them with the scale from the government projects going on hold. But it's looking really good now, and everyone's sort of moving back online.
Great. And how about you, Georgie? Does that sound like what's going on in Melbourne, or is there a different picture emerging?
Does sound similar. I think last year was not as buoyant as we've seen previously. We found that decision making took much longer than we anticipated of our clients making calls on whether they were going to hire or not. And I think that was based on their own clients putting projects on hold. There hasn't been as much government-led infrastructure work. I think there's been a huge overspend on that currently, or in the past few years, but it does mean that we'll get a new Melbourne Metro and some other significant rail projects opening up soon. But I think the kitty is dry. The kitty is empty on that front. Housing as well has been extremely busy. Social housing, I think, is a real push across every city, but particularly Melbourne. So architecture practices who focus in that area, I think, have been pretty steady, and seniors living as well. I feel like there is a lot more optimism about this year, and people are less cautious about moving forward with things. Thank goodness. And like Krista said, I think it's still very much an employer's market compared to a couple of years ago. when it was a candidate market, and candidates were kind of calling the shots. I think it's definitely swung in the other direction, and the employers are really kind of in the driver's seat.
What you said, it's really interesting. You said it does feel just less cautious, and that's the vibe I got from a lot of the clients I spoke to last year. They wanted to get going, but maybe we're going to hold off and do this. But now it just feels like let's go, let's do it.
And I think if we get rate cuts, there's obviously a lot going on right now, which is, we're waiting for everyone's saying we'll get an interest rate cut. So I think the inflation's, coming under control. And if that happens, there's a lot of projects that I think they're like bulls at the gate, ready to go. And I think that'll be, then we'll be very, very busy if that goes on, which will be pleasing for everyone.
Which is great because the pantry is full of really good candidates. That's kind of where we feel at the moment.
That's what we like to hear. Towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, we at Bespoke Careers conducted a survey. We went out to approximately 1,000 architecture and design professionals around the world because we wanted to really find out what the sentiment is, both for employers and candidates. And out of that research, plus all of the data we have internally from our vacancies and our placements, we put together this report, the Global Salary Guide for Architecture and Design. It's the most comprehensive in the market. And you three and your teams have been out and about in the early part of the year delivering these to clients. So what has been some of the feedback from clients about the findings, and how's it been going to the offices and handing these out?
I mean, everyone loves the data, and I think the global reach of it. So I think there's always the interest in, your particular exact what you have in your practice, but people are always wanting to know what's going on further afield. So I think, everyone loves the full update. I think there's always a bit of a focus into whatever sector they're sort of, or where they're finding the pressure points. And it is, I think that data is, it reads well because people, they look at it and go, oh yeah, we've noticed we've had to, bump up people at that tier or in that role. But I think it's very well received.
Also, the additional info at the start about other motivators for moving jobs, I think, has also been really well received.
It's such an invaluable document that our clients, a tool that they use, and they really look forward to receiving it every year. And I think especially, and you guys can attest this, over the last couple of years when during COVID, where salaries were going, up very quickly, I think it's a document they really look forward to receiving to see what they're looking at for this year and what they might have to do to keep their staff on board. So it's it's incredibly useful, I think.
Yeah, I think it's great as well, being able to see the differences between the cities. Obviously, you've got Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney in there, but you also have New York, California, Texas, London, and we've got Dubai and Riyadh in there as well. So it's a great way to kind of get a sense check of how the global industry is going. So that's great. But one of the things was, so we included a bunch of data kind of comparing some of the global trends, but we didn't have enough room in this guide to be able to get really niche, because it is a global guide, and sort of do the sort of city by city comparisons. So this is why one of the reasons we're jumping on this webinar here. We wanted to go through some of the findings from that. So we produced this report, the Architecture and Design Market Report 2025 in Australia. And I thought we'd just go through this kind of page by page, and we can talk about some of the findings that came through. Okay, so this first slide here shows how people are feeling about job satisfaction. So we can see a really positive sentiment across the board. Luke, what did you make of this?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting for Brisbane that it's so significantly higher than the other cities. And I was wondering if lifestyle really played into that here as well. Like, we are very early risers. We go to bed early. We've got a really strong culture of good work-life balance, beautiful weather. So I wonder if all those kind of factors play into it as well. The other thing I was thinking of is Brisbane is a city that's catching up with Sydney and Melbourne. So the projects that we're working on now, our clients are working on, are really exciting. And they're probably in par with what's been happening in Sydney and Melbourne. Salaries are increasing. So I think a bit more diversity. I think it's a city that's on the rise.
Georgie, don't don't despair. Plus 27 is still a really positive score. It just looks not so great when it's next to the other two. So why do you think it is that Melbourne's lagging just a little bit in terms of satisfaction?
Oh, maybe it's conversely, Queensland weather, Melbourne weather. I don't know. I think there has been it feels like the project pipelines have slowed down a lot compared to the previous years. So maybe that has influenced people's outlooks in terms of perhaps less or fewer options if they were looking at moving on.
It's still up though, isn't it? Plus 27. So.
It's still up. It's still up. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still up.
I think Sydney, it's continues. I know we're not peaking with Brisbane, but jokes aside on the weather, I think Sydney's still, I think people are happy working here. There's lots of good projects. There's international firms. There's a real mix. There's the local market of, the housing shortage that's kind of driving that and keeping it buoyant. So I feel like people, they've got options here, and there's been probably less affected, I think, than Victoria, I think, in the last couple of years. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Tony?
Yeah, I think so.
It's been what Luke said. I think it's very livable, and people are really excited about the growth up there, and also the Olympics. So despite the stalling of projects and not knowing which way it will go, I think people are really, and there's a lot of people looking to move there. They have moved there. That net migration, I can't remember the numbers, but people have moved to Brisbane, relocated from other places.
But I think as well, something you said, Chris, is interesting. Melbourne's had a rough few years. I don't know if this plays into it at all, but Brisbane or Queensland was the least lockdown state. So in terms of being affected by COVID, I think we just perhaps, we weren't as affected as much as other cities. So I don't know if that plays into it as well, into the psyche.
We're still feeling that ricochet effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the last time we did a report of this sort of magnitude was 2021, and there were a few questions that we didn't ask that time that we have asked this time. So this is one of those ones where we don't have a direct comparison with previous years, but we're looking forward to the next year where we can see sort of how these shift and change in the next 12 months. So you see as we go through. So with the salary increase, 4.99%, this was right in the middle of the UK and the US. In terms of the percentage increase. But it was the only country of the three studied that outpaced the national average. So we saw architecture and design salaries increasing 4.99% in Australia compared to the national average of 3.75%. So a good year to be an architect or designer if you live in Australia.
I wonder, I think that the lower end salaries, I know there was a bit of uplift there because they're quite low within architecture. And I feel like the pressure of the last couple of years with inflation, it's really put pressure on those sort of salary bandings. And on architecture as a general rule is not paid. They're not paid enough. The architects, they should be paid more. So I don't know. I think it's probably that uplift maybe because there's been really not much wage growth across Australia.
Yeah, it's not actually in this report, but we did ask about the perceived salary gap. And Australians reported feeling like they were about 9.6% underpaid. But that was actually the lowest of the three nations. So US came in at 13.4, UK at 11.3. So in terms of salary sort of discrepancy or the perceived salary gap, Australia's doing pretty well. And here we can see how we're feeling. And that's just such a massive jump since 2021 and a really good indication that people are feeling better about their paychecks now than they were sort of during the pandemic.
I think people got a huge uplift in the years 2022.
Yeah.
And there were hikes in salaries and people were bidding for talent. So we would see people getting a 20K pay increase, that weren't that senior. So that they're huge numbers. And there was that kind of bidding war. It was a frenzied market. It was hard. There were more projects than people could deliver. They didn't have the resources. People were working. It was they were working more hours. So I think a lot of practices that I've seen and directors have said, even though it's been tough the last year, they're feeling really good now because it's a bit more controlled. It's not a market where they can't keep up with the work. While they may have had some of their best financial years, they're not, hiring people that aren't right necessarily because they just need someone in to do the job or things like that. Like I think it's a bit steadier. And I feel like people who are doing in the team are probably feeling that as well. They're feeling happier because they might not have had the massive bump in the pay rise, but they've had it recently.
We're coming to terms with the fact that a 20K pay rise year on year is
Yeah.
not achievable. It's not realistic. I feel like we have a lot of those conversations.
It's a good sign. It's a good sign, and again, we'll keep our eyes on this over the next 12 months because it seems like what we're seeing in the market in terms of buoyancy and projects getting green lights, that this is just going to be a trend that continues to increase, which is great for the well-being of our architecture and design professionals. The gender pay gap, it was the widest in Australia out of the 3 countries. So there's work to be done for sure. Are firms aware of this? Are they taking steps? What's the kind of feeling?
The Workplace Gender Equality, I think WGEA, if you have more than 100 people now in Australia, you have to report on all of your salary. There's no pay secrecy anymore, so you have to disclose. You can't say to someone, don't tell someone else who's the same level that you're earning more. So I think there's been some big, proper legislative changes that have come into act in the last 12 months. And there's also, the last, I would even say, 15 years in Sydney at least, and across Australia, we've been focusing on gender equity, and there's the Institute have really been driving and pushing. We've sponsored quite a few events in the past. People have been looking at it, how to get, in lots of different ways, getting people back to the workforce after they've had paternity leave, many different layers, and also about, in the actual office. So I think there's a lot of things in play now that should be closing this. It's obviously nowhere near closed.
It relates pretty clearly to the number of women in leadership roles, and I feel like that is front of mind for most practices that we deal with. They're very conscious of increasing the number of women in leadership roles, and I think in maybe 10 years' time we might see parity. I don't know, but not. It'll take time, but I think we're heading in the right direction.
Well, Georgie, it's a win in the Melbourne column. You've got the lowest gap out of the 3 by quite some distance, 13%. So obviously, it's better to be a woman in Melbourne if you work in architecture.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so.
One of the great things about what we do, though, is that we can be part of the change making. So, ensuring that we're sending candidates through at equitable pay rates, regardless of gender, and really, we're talking with directors and hiring managers and really influencing them on what they should be paying their teams. So being involved in this change for positive is actually a really brilliant thing.
And this is a conversation that we have, isn't it? We have it all the time, and we've done a lot of training internally to make sure we're doing all of the right things on that front. And I think, that Georgie's right too, that it's a focus for a lot of practices. They're saying, we need to equal it up in our leadership team or in whatever layer it is. From graduates, someone said to me the other day, we've actually gone too far the other way with our graduates, so we're seeing we might have a problem in 15 years. So we need to kind of, it's a balancing act.
Yeah, and we did touch on the gender representation. You can see here, 63% of the leadership positions are held by men, which is most pronounced in Sydney of the 3 cities.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. It's still a conversation daily, and I would even say for Misty at strategic level, balancing at the top level, but it's also, even for candidates, they'll look at a website. So one thing I would say is make sure, it's not even before when they're in the door in the interview or who's interviewing them, but they're looking at the website and they're seeing, I don't see any diversity.
That's a good point. Like, representation matters so much, doesn't it?
It does, and people are looking at that from their first pass at every bit of content, or the website that they go into or the interview that they come into, and they kind of picking it up, and they'll say things to us when they, it doesn't look like it, and we'll say, oh no, there's a bit of, but I think that's something else that's people care.
And it's like, well, you can be the change that you want to see. You can be the first woman to go into that office and into a leadership role. Yeah.
All right, so changing up a little bit, we're looking at reasons for moving jobs. So this was a really interesting piece of data. We asked people sort of what their top 3 motivating factors were. And this is just the people who had sort of indicated that they were thinking about moving jobs in the next 12 months. This is what came out. Work-life balance, which is just clearly the number 1 factor. And this was true of the US and the UK. What did you make of this, Krista, this list here? Does this kind of reflect the conversations that you're having with candidates?
Yeah, I think so, and I'm pleased to see it, and I think it's really telling. I think people have had to work very hard. I think, pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic, they've been navigating coming out of hybrid working environments. There's also the right to disconnect that's been brought into play as well, Monitoring Australia, which is kind of really, I guess, protecting the work-life balance of someone and making sure that they're not having to respond to emails at 2 a.m. I mean, that's just, that's a wild example. But kind of just setting boundaries. And I think that there's that layering here within legislation and within Fair Work, and employees have now got really good parameters. So I think that feeds through the policies, and there's really clear boundaries. And that sort of is, that's sort of framing the culture, so people understand what's expected of them, what the output is that they'll be, required to give. Obviously, there will be competitions in our sector, and they might work a weekend, but they might then get time in lieu back, whereas they may not have had that in the past, or they might get paid, time and a half or something else if they're working on a contract basis. So I think, it's really, really good. I think flexibility, it's often, it might just be within the day that really matters to someone, because it might be you can do the pickup and then come in and, something like that after with kids, particularly. I think for carers, I think that can be really helpful, that ability, or go to a doctor's appointment or do a gym session at lunchtime. So I think all of those top ones are kind of feeding into each other.
I've been working in the architecture and design industry, well, in this role for about 2 years. I have always, during that time, thought that pay was the number one motivating factor for employees, and I was really surprised to see it at number 4 here. Did it surprise you, Georgie, or is this kind of just how it is?
No, it didn't surprise me. In fact, I liked the comment here that the difference between men and women, actually, that pay was a motivator for some, were for men, and for women it ranked 5th. I would say that a lot of the conversations we're having at senior level, it's more about projects and culture and people rather than pay. So I was not surprised about that. Whereas at the junior levels, I think, as they're rising up the ranks, and they haven't realised that that pay isn't everything, and that really who you work with and enjoying coming to work is paramount.
There's obviously a massive difference in this between not only sort of gender and age group, but also just sector. So between architecture and interior design as well. And so maybe in the next report, we'll have more of a look at that. Moving on to hybrid working, this is one of the hottest topics, and it has been a hottest topic since COVID and even before COVID. So often talked about that I'm almost sick of talking about it, but we're here to talk about it. So it seems like the last 12 months, employers have been bringing their employees in more. That seems to be what they've been wanting to do for some years, and we're actually starting to see some action on it now. How are employees feeling about this, Luke? Is this something that they're pushing back on, or are they kind of seeing the value of in-office time?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the clients we speak to are definitely trying to bring their teams back into the office now. And at a most, they might have a structure where it's 2 days work from home, 3 days in the office. But those days are dictated as to, when your team is in, you have to be in those days. Or when the whole team's in, they like to do a big team meeting together. So, yeah, so I think there is still some flexibility, but we're seeing it less and less, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we sort of spoke about it earlier, but it's still the employers have kind of got the upper hand to bring people back in, because it's, so if you're an employee saying, I want you to work remote from somewhere else, there's someone else who's probably applying who wants to work in the office, and if that's their preference, there's still a struggle to get a job, I guess, this market right now. And I think in terms of like collaborating on projects, a lot of practices have just said, for designing and mentoring and lots of other reasons that actually make a difference to the service output of an architect, we actually really think it works better for you to be sitting together. And maybe it's not 5 days a week, but it's probably 4 days a week in Australia. Like it is very rare now to have someone working 100% remote, I would say. There's some practices that are doing 3-2, but I'd say 5 or 4 is probably the mainstream. So it's quite rare. it's not impossible to get a remote job, but it's not something that seems to be preferable unless someone has a bit of an international team or they are remote and they want other people to be remote so they don't have to have an office and an overhead.
I think a couple of years ago, employers were saying, we'd prefer you if you could be in 5 days a week, but if you don't want to, that's okay. We can work around you. And now they're just like, well, this is what we do with 5 days in the office. If you've got a tradie come to your house, fine. Or you need to go to your kids' school assembly, of course we can accommodate that. Or you're sick but not sick enough to have a day off, then don't spread your germs. So they're realistic about life. Life happens, but doesn't mean you can still work even if you're not in the office. But I think it's all about trust as well, isn't it? And about empowering staff and understanding that they'll still get their job done even if they're not under your direct gaze. But I find as you said, Mike, I'm almost sick of talking about hybrid working because it does come up in every conversation. But it's, for a reason. It was such a huge shift during the COVID years that it is still kind of clawing back or figuring out what is a normal situation, and that's still quite nebulous, I think.
Often when we speak to graduates that are going for their first role, they have this kind of list of demands that they want stepping in, and sometimes we say to them, you just have to start and get a year under your belt, build that trust, and then you can start asking for some flexibility or things like that. I think just you need to go and really prove yourself and some old school kind of business ethics that get some runs on the board and really build that trust with your employer before you can start asking for those types of things. So there is a return to old school values.
Yeah.
And you learn so much from being around people. Yeah.
And that's the thing. You need to learn osmotically, don't you? So if you're starting a new job and half the senior team's working from home, you're not going to call them because you're probably new and feeling a bit intimidated or nervous or, whatever. So you really need people in the office to help you and guide you through those first year or two.
And I think if they are going, you're right, like it'll be past those thresholds of probation where they'll let someone say, okay, then it will be a discussion we will have. But when you start, it's 5 days in the office. Yeah.
That's probably better that way anyway. That's how I talk about it. It's better to be in the office in those first few months, just for visibility, building relationships, all those things that you can't do behind a screen very well.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've got strong opinions about this subject.
It was definitely interesting to see the country split on this one. So Australia were very much the most in office of the three nations, which is interesting. But they also had the highest preference to be in the office of the three nations. So something about living in Australia that makes office life a little bit more manageable and enjoyable for employees than over here in the UK and in the US as well.
Well, I think maybe because Australia, the bulk of our population is so centered around big cities. So, in London, a lot of people live maybe 1 or 2 hours out of the city. So coming into the city every day is really expensive and whatever might be for other reasons, difficult train strikes, etc. But in Australia, most people live quite close to the city. It's easy to get in. So that kind of barrier to getting into the office maybe is not as profound here.
It's a really good point. So we now have 4 generations in the workforce at one time, and don't ask me to name them because I've lost track. But I think it was really interesting to see the split here amongst those. A lot of clients are talking about sort of how to manage 4 different perspectives, 4 different sort of ways of working, 4 different expectations. So I think it's really helpful here to see sort of what the priorities are of those age groups. So I don't know if we want to start with sort of the number one reason for moving jobs and how you can see that evolves over time. Krista, did you have any thoughts there?
I think that this is always probably been a problem, I suppose, of how to keep people happy under one workplace. But I think the refurbishment of all of the policies and legislations that we've seen globally and, I don't know, work on, culture, diversity, inclusion, all of the things that make up practices, I feel like now practices can cater for all needs because they've got all of this framework. So then, I think for the different age groups, it's kind of like a pick and mix of what matters to them. So there might be heaps of socials going on in an office, and maybe that's attracting, people that are of a certain generation, for example, or other people want culture and they want, I don't know. I think it's the things that we lacked that we probably crave. So I think I'm looking at where I fall, and we probably don't need to talk about that. But I think culture is really important today because we probably we didn't have as much of that when I came up through the ranks. Whereas work-life balance, I don't know. I feel like that's pretty good for me now. It's more flexible than it was when I started out. So that's not my number one driver.
Even though my age doesn't reflect it, I think I do fall kind of smack bang into the work-life balance and a company culture, because I grew up, like, when I first, obviously, first years of my working life was 5 days a week in the office. So company culture was really important to me. But I was part of that generation that did get to switch then to, as we all, I guess, we switched to, working remotely, and that, so work-life balance is is an important factor. So I think I do fall probably smack bang in the middle of what the two things that are really important to me in a workplace.
You've just aged yourself 10 years.
I
Luke.
just said, no, I don't fall, I'm very much in the first kind of bracket there.
Righto.
Yeah, well, we do have this generation entering the workforce now that has never experienced anything like we had pre-COVID. So the hybrid working model is the norm, and they haven't had anything else to compare it with. But you can see their preference for working 3.22 days is up there with the highest preference of the lot, just below the 45 to 54 age group. So yeah, they're in the office more often, and they do like to be in the office as well, I think, in general.
But they're going to leave if they don't get that flexibility, whereas, we're probably almost getting exactly what we would want. So it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. This report, by the way, is available for download. So if you want to have a look at any of these numbers in more detail, you're welcome to do that just by visiting bespokecareers.com. I wanted to have a look at this. Brisbane obviously leading the way in terms of the contract workforce, but we're seeing contractors play an increasingly pivotal role in workforce strategies in Australia. So I wanted to ask why firms adopting contractors, and how can Bespoke help?
Well, I think, in uncertain markets, contractors are the better choice.
I think it's just lean and agile. So it's as lean and agile as you can be if you want to make sure you don't have to have any laying off people and redundancies, depending on which market you're in. That's definitely been a cost to people over the last few years if they had to reduce. And I think now we're really seeing people go, you know what, we've got work coming on, but let's have a continue. We want this % of them to be on contract, and it really is flexible, isn't it? So they can kind of scale up and scale down quickly, or convert them to permanent. So I think we're getting a lot of requests in now, and we've had contractor numbers going up steadily since things have really been picking up since mid-year last year in 24.
Yep, I think it's a conversation that is expanding, and some companies who've never considered it before are suddenly realising how valuable bringing on a contractor or two or three could be. And I'm wondering, I've never actually thought about it before, but in this conversation, I wonder if it relates to that whole the kind of work-life balance. So rather than thrashing your existing staff to work time and a half, hire another person just to get over the hump, and then everyone's happy.
Yeah, I think definitely.
Well, I guess that's the bottom line. I mean, another overhead, but in the big picture, it's valuable.
Krista, what can Bespoke do to help? What does it look like for an employer who's looking to hire contractors through Bespoke Careers?
It's actually pretty good, because we've got a constant flow of people who are immediate coming into the market. So it's normally attracting quite a different person and it's normally really important what sort of software they have, for example. So it's normally someone who's coming in and who's documenting. I mean, obviously there's a full range of roles, but on the architecture side, it'd be, project-based normally. We've got a deadline, we need to get this package out, or we've won a project, we're going to build a team, but we're just not 100% sure yet. And they'll come to us and say, we need someone. We actually have a whole lot of internal processes at Bespoke that mean that we get people out to our clients who are looking for contractors as quickly as we can. So we've kind of got a response rate that needs to be, within hours, not days, for a contract requirement. And if we can't get exactly what someone needs, then we'll say, right, we've got this person who's a bit more senior, and a bit, maybe you could complement them with, other skill sets that we've got available. So we'll kind of try and solve the problem as quickly as we can. But we've got, we've normally got, as Georgie said, on the pantries, the shelves are stocked. Because we spend time making sure we foster that group, because there's a group of people that do also want to work short term. So there's, they might be between jobs, or they might be arriving from overseas back, and they just want to kind of get in and do some work on contract and see what the market's like before they commit. So I think it works both ways. It's a good it's a good partnership, for someone who's coming in. They're getting paid for the hours that they're doing, and you're, not tied into the employee kind of obligations of having a full-time person in the team, if you're not sure.
And the employer doesn't have to worry about tax contributions, super contributions, worrying about all that onboarding process.
Yeah, we just take care of everything. So it's great.
Cool. All right, on to the final slide. So I thought this one was particularly interesting, the Wellbeing Index. So the way this is calculated is we take the scores from 5 different factors. So how much they feel valued, how manageable the workload is, the mental health support they receive, how often they're working overtime, and how much of their annual leave they're using. And we took those answers and calculated sort of an overall wellbeing score. And you can see here that Sydney's leading the way in that respect, but we do have an overall positive well-being. So we have a happy, healthy workforce in Australia, which is really encouraging to see within the architecture and design industry.
Great. I'm not surprised to see that. I feel like the market, there's been a lot of conversations about this. I know our last year talk with Marilyn and the one before, they really focused on a lot of the stuff that sort of sets this framework for, I think, wellbeing. And I think that comes down to, people being aware of it, and, they're actually talking to it and making a big effort, and people want people to be happy in the workplace. A lot of them are also, I'm using Marilyn again, but they might be outsourcing and using someone like Marilyn Spicer from Catalina, who'll come in and say, okay, people know that they can't have a practice and just start and not have policies and have frameworks for people to be, looked after. And that's from everything from, the hybrid policy, the flexibility policy, all of the other things that come, the paternity leave policy, all of those things through to, when will I have my annual review? Will I have a career development review? Will I have a salary review? And I think all of those things are sort of, people are getting really good at laying it out. In Sydney particularly too, and I don't think this has had a huge weight on it, but the conversation from the Institute, we've been sponsoring the Best Practice Award in Sydney for, I don't even know, I think probably 8 years or something like that. And that kind of shines the light. It's very much like the age, is it the AJ in the UK, Micah?
AJ 100, yeah.
It's a very similar sort of survey, and we interview everyone, and there's a focus each time, and that kind of shines a light on what practices are doing really, really well, and then someone wins the award. So I think in Sydney and in New South Wales, that's the New South Wales part of the Institute, it is a conversation. There's a whole prizes night for, about people and their contributions and things that are outside of the project. So I think it's a really nice time to be working as an architect. And I think it's probably similar in Melbourne and Brisbane. And I don't know why Sydney's so much higher, particularly. I mean, there's lots of good stuff that's been going on. There's lots of refurbished offices. People have, they've had some good years and they've spent money on their teams. People, most people that work in architecture, they care about, giving back, and, they're sort of doing it for the good of community as well as for their teams. I think there's a lot of really good people that work in our sector as well, I'm guessing in all the cities. It attracts good humans to architecture. I think there's, layers within that as well, with professional growth offered, and kind of, a lot of people want to know how will I progress in this practice. So I think there's lots of different elements to it. I'm not sure why Sydney's so much higher though, because I guess, is that kind of what you're seeing in Brisbane and Melbourne?
Yes, and I think it ties in generally with a culture of talking more about mental health, and maybe that's tying in with it as well. And people feeling comfortable to raise their hand if they need, additional time off, or, reduced hours, or, whatever they need to make them feel more, I guess, working at their best. But it is interesting. I don't know why Sydney's double.
No, I don't know either. I mean, there's a lot of them in focus groups. They'll talk about what, they might have a social group, and then they'll have a wellbeing group and an event. They'll organise events for the office, and kind of that will be driven by the teams. I think but that's probably quite mainstream across practices in Australia. But
I wonder if it's also being the international city, you probably get a lot more overseas workers coming in, and the working conditions in Australia are probably incredible compared to what they've got back home. So they could be contributing to this as well.
Ooh, that's an interesting theory. Yep.
Not positive though, which is good.
Yeah, if you want to find out more about health in the workplace, we do have a podcast episode with Dr. Kirsten Brown, who will take you through all of that stuff and more. So we'll put a link to that in the comments or the description. But that's us, team. Thank you so much for your time. It seems like things are really positive. I'm excited. It sounds like our clients are excited. We know now that the architecture and design professions in Australia are excited about the next 12 months. So maybe just a little word on Bespoke Careers, Georgie, if you wouldn't mind, and what an employer can expect after they get in touch.
Right. Oh, put me on the spot. I didn't know you were going to shine a light on me.
Yes, go.
A real person landing in their office, having a face-to-face conversation and getting to know their company a bit more, and understanding the structure and culture and how we can help or where the gaps are, and then guiding them through the process of who they might expect to see through us, the level of detail and frequency, and also access to all of these valuable assets and content that Bespoke globally has put together. What I always fall back on is the fact that we're all from the design industry, and I think that really resonates with our clients as well. So I was a registered architect, now non-practicing, before I found Bespoke, and everyone in our office has worked in design previously, so we can really understand the motivations and of candidates and understand how people fit into practices of all scales. And we care. I couldn't do this for any other industry. I really care for the people, like the people who are trying to build a team and the people who are trying to find a home, so it's very satisfying. There you go, unscripted.
That was great. If you haven't already got a copy of the Bespoke Careers Global Salary Guide, you can find that now on our website. We also have the slides that you've seen today available for download. So head to bespokecareers.com and you'll find all of that and more. Thank you again, Luke, Krista, Georgie, for joining us. Super insightful conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Micah.
Thanks, Micah.
Thanks for having us.